Hi, so we're Massenet. I'm Anna Camfield. I use she, her pronouns.
I'm Nishaly. I use she, her.
I'm Defne. I use she, her.
I'm Elena. I use she, her.
And we're going to be talking about the film Double Indemnity, which is directed by Billy Wilder. And it's the story of a insurance salesman who falls in love with his client's wife, and they plot to kill his client so that way she can get money and he'll get it too, and they can like be together and fall in love. But obviously it doesn't go according to plan, because otherwise that'd be a really boring movie. But we're going to be talking about the paradox of how we as the audience, because we're involved with the I guess they're the protagonists, but the antagonists, because they're planning on murdering somebody, because we're seeing it from their side of the film. We are along for the ride of we think everything's going to go well and fine for them, and we think everything works out perfect. But at the end of the film, because it doesn't work out perfect, we're left just as shocked as the characters who are plotting this murder. So we're going to talk about moments in the film that showcase that paradox and help lead the audience to understand that. Neff and Phyllis are not going to be able to complete the plan that they have so enjoyed planning together.
I also
I think it's important to note also the moments we're going to be talking about is what Hugh was talking about of the people around them not knowing what's going on. So those are the moments we're going to be talking about, like things that we know that other people don't know. Because if everyone else knew, it wouldn't be as fun.
You know, like the whole like I know that you know that I know that you know just goes in circles and circles.
Yeah, like the paradox of like the unsuspecting bystander. Like if these people can hide a murder so well until it's not so good anymore, then my next door neighbor or the insurance guy who comes to my house can be a murderer. So like it kind of makes you question, like, not everything, but people's roles in society, and you look at them and you think, well, these people hit it so well, maybe there's other people out there like them.
And then I also think part of the irony of it is that we're witnessing, like, you know, the perfect crime until, you know, it eventually does get discovered later on in the film. But, you know, like up until a certain point, we're witnessing essentially the perfect crime. And so it's something that no one on the outside knows about. But at the same time, we're watching it and we're also being told exactly how it's being carried out and how it's being hidden by one of the primary people involved in it. We're all hearing, you know, like how they covered it up and what they're planning through Neff's voiceover, literally.
Yeah, it's so cool because like we know from the beginning, you know, like it just opens up and he's like, I did it. So it's not like other movies where we like figuring it out through the way, like, yeah, like, the fact that
right in the beginning,
and like it's still entertaining that we can watch it is because we're like going through it too.
And that's something that I think was brought up like in class as well, to a degree of because we were contrasting sort of the, you know, the noir style of like crime detective sort of stories with, you know, like the Sherlock Holmes style, where, you know, like with the Holmes sort of like deductive, you know, like case thing, we're watching it like essentially from the outside. You know, like we see the crime, like, you know, as it happens, and we have to figure out how it's gotten to that point. Meanwhile, in noir, we're on the inside and we sort of see, you know, like the fun really isn't in so much as in figuring it out with the protagonist as it would be like in a Sherlock story, but sort of like seeing how it unravels.
Totally.
Yeah. In the beginning, he like something that I think is like classically noir is there's no illusion that he's going to succeed. Like, you know, from the get-go, he says the line, I did it for money and I did it for a girl, but I didn't get the money, I didn't get the girl. He's like sitting in this chair, he's shot, like, you know it went bad. Like, but you're still kind of rooting for him throughout the movie because, you know, he's like this anti-hero who got like seduced by this femme fatale who's manipulating him. But, you know, it establishes that kind of hopelessness that like, he didn't succeed, and now we get to see like how he got to that point he is in the first few minutes of the movie, which I think is Interesting, yeah.
In the beginning, I assumed that even though he didn't get the girl or the money, that he was gonna get away with the crime. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like thinking like he's like confessing to it, like he knows he's done for, like he knows, like he wants to go out on his own terms type thing, because everything else that happened was not on his own terms. It was very much like executed by Phyllis Diedrichson.
Yeah, I guess I just I felt like I was like, he got away with it and now he's like running away or something, but he just like wants people to know. So even though I knew he didn't get the girl or the money, I was still like, in my eyes, watching the perfect crime. You know?
I didn't expect, you know, I guess like the present to catch up to the I don't know, to the voiceover part, because in the final scenes we do see, you know, like Keyes stumble like into the office and literally catch Neff in the act of recording his confession. And, you know, like then I don't know, like the two parts of the film catch up to each other, you know, like the flashback and like the current confession voiceover. I was honestly expecting the credits to just like cut like when Neff finishes telling the story and we don't see, you know, like any interaction beyond that, but then we didn't, because Keyes comes in and then they have that last conversation together where where like the cigarette lighting is flipped, where instead of Neff giving Keyes the light, Keyes gives Neff the light.
Yeah. Well,
there was a lot of moments like the cigarette lighting and the line till the end of the line that Phyllis and Neff say to each other all the time, where like it was repeated so much throughout the film that I was like, there has to be something like clever at the end of the film, or at like the really like the climax of the film, because they keep repeating it so much, and if they just keep repeating it with the same like meaning, it's gonna just like fall stale. And so I kind of liked how they did the switch at the end of the cigarette lighting, because I was hoping that that's what they were gonna do, and they did, and I was really happy.
And I think it's also kind of commenting on how like Neff thought he was in control the whole time until he collapsed in that doorway. He was like, I'm gonna get away, I'm gonna go to Mexico. And then that kind of control, that illusion of control that he had kind of reflected itself in lighting Keyes' cigarette, because he was like, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's doing, I'm kind of above him. But then Keyes kind of then ended up getting the upper hand, and then he's the one who lit the cigarette. Like Neff was helpless to him. And again, with that like to the end of the line quote, like Phyllis and Neff say it as kind of like we're in this together, baby. But then when Keyes says it, it kind of flips a connotation where it's like the guy who is unsuspecting of his insurance partner now kind of knows what's happening, and now he's in control. And then he says they're stuck with each other at the end of the line, and it's no longer something nice and romantic. It's now something kind of unfortunate and hopeless.
Yeah, it sort of swaps from, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I also think it's really funny how Keyes, even though like we're always supposed to see him as like not in control of the situation because we're supposed to see Neff as in control, he's the one that unravels the whole thing, and it's Keyes is what the whole story is kind of dependent on, is if Keyes figures it out or not, and especially if Keyes figured out and like if he turns on Neff. And so even though like we're supposed to see it as like he's like, oh, he doesn't know anything, like Neff's gonna get away with it, he's figuring it out, and he's actually the one that I think is in control of the whole story. As if this man figures it out, then like this whole thing goes to shreds.
Yeah, and it's sort of like, because I think the part of the reason why we don't take him as seriously at the beginning is because he's almost presented a bit like a comic relief character. He's the one that sort of is consistently there with the jokes, you know, like when, like in that one scene where he's calling out him and Neff's boss, sort of like he does it in a very effective way, in a very, you know, like in a way that he makes the audience know that he knows what he's talking about, but also in a sort of comedic way. And so I guess that it kind of disarms the audience a little bit. We don't expect the guy who's presented as the comic relief of the film to be, you know, like someone who's so crucial in unraveling the main conspiracy of it.
Yeah, I think we should move on to moments in the film where the paradox happens.
Yeah.
Do you guys?
Yeah, the unsuspicion.
Yes. So I guess the first one I noticed was when they were talking about, well, actually, I don't know if this is considered this, but the fact that it starts with him confessing and we already know what's happened, immediately makes me feel like we're in that place of like, we know what's happening, no one else does, even though he hasn't planned on like killing him yet, if that makes sense. So like he's like it's like, I did this, and then it cuts to like him walking into a home with like kids around, and then the wife, anyways.
I mean, like, I'd say even the lead up to that, right? Because sort of like before
he doesn't know he's gonna kill him yet, but we know he has already. So we're like watching that happen. Yeah. Were you gonna say something? Sorry.
Oh no, but yeah, like no, I was just gonna say like even like after that sort of like the buildup of it, where even if we have the context of, you know, like this guy's actually going to like he's actually going to go through it, he's going to commit the murder. I guess it's sort of like, I don't know. I feel like a lot of the experience in watching these kinds of films where the end is already told to you is that you kind of doubt it when you're viewing the actual film, right? You're sort of like when you're actually seeing the scene where, you know, like before it's going to happen, it's sort of like, oh, like is the murder actually going to happen? You know, like are they actually going to get found out? Is it actually going to go wrong? Because, you know, like all the things that have been, you know, like hinted to us up until this point seem like, you know, it's going to go fine, or that, you know, it's not going to go off the rails, or something like that. And it's sort of that doubt of, is what's been promised to us actually going to occur?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess one of the first moments that I wrote down was when they first started planning the murder, and then they had dinner with all their friends and the husband, and they're just talking about the scheme like behind the door, even though they're right there. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. I find that all the time with what's it called, the bystander, the ignorant bystander, like they're so close to being heard, or like so close to being caught, but they don't, and that's why they're ignorant. But yeah, that first moment is like they're talking about it with him right there, you know.
Yeah, I also noticed something like that with the place they chose to meet up to talk about the murder, which was a public place. They met in a supermarket surrounded by like families and stuff, and every time they had to discuss the murder and the crime and what followed after, they didn't want to do it on the phone, so they did it in this extremely crowded public place filled with ignorant bystanders, like unsuspecting bystanders. And I think it's like commentary on how all these people were so consumed with their own lives that they didn't see like the obviousness sitting right in front of them, like two people like clearly speaking about like killing someone, but they're worried about like getting the can on the top shelf. Like there's this one scene with a mother and her son, and she like cuts in between them as they're talking about having killed Mr. Diedrichson, and she's like, wait, let me just get that. And so everyone is kind of like ignorant to what they're really doing.
Yeah. Also, like similarly to that, like she was calling on a public phone, I think also next to a store. And it's the part where Barton, like Keys, he's like right next to him on the phone too. And yeah, he was like signing a paper, like reading papers or something. So they're just so, everyone's so consumed.
Yeah, like that one scene in like in the office, right, where he gets a call from her, and then he has to he calls her by a fake name and keeps the conversation very general. Yeah, that one. And then it also, like, that reminds me too, because it's another similar scene where sort of like where Neff is there, Phyllis is there, Keys is there, and Neff and Phyllis are hiding something from Keys. It's the scene in the hallway outside of Neff's apartment where he tells Phyllis, you know, like, oh yeah, come over, it's safe. But then Keys shows up before her. So then she has to hide behind the door as Keys is going out into the hall. And, you know, like if they had made one wrong move there, then, you know, like everything, like the whole thing would have been blown wide open. And he doesn't like, and then like he's completely like he doesn't even like think to suspect that, you know, like the crime essentially is hiding right behind the door that he's just come out of.
It's also like Keyes so often was interrupting this plan, but without knowing it. Like he wasn't intentionally trying to interrupt like the killer. He was talking to his colleague, his friend. Like he didn't ever think Neff was involved. Like when we hear the message that Neff listened to on the recorder, he's like, no, don't track Neff. Like I know Neff for 11 years. Like he's great. But he's still like, he always ends up interrupting Neff or being there when Neff is trying to talk to Phyllis about this murder that they committed. And he's interrupting like at the apartment, in the office, even like when he calls him into the meeting with the guy from the train. And he's like, Neff was on the train and the guy saw him kind of. And he's like calling him in. He's like, that could have been another moment where it was blown wide open. And Keyes didn't know that he was the innocent bystander and not knowing that. But he still was causing all these problems for the killers without even having to try.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And I think that like moments like that, like when Defne said when Phyllis hid behind the door, this whole like paradox of like, what don't we see? Like what don't we like realize is like who's committing crime and who's not. Like it makes you question who's innocent and who's not. It kind of makes you think like, you know, makes you think to look behind doors like that and kind of like creates that paranoia within the audience that the characters usually have within these types of movies, and kind of like that, you know, innate suspicion about everything and that kind of like questioning about motives and like good and bad.
And you also have the innocent bystander who doesn't cause, who kind of causes problems, but doesn't really as like the same extent as Keyes, which is Lola, the daughter, because Neff has, for the whole film, Neff has this like soft spot for like her as like a kid, like doesn't want her to get hurt in this situation, even though he's killing her father. But she's not like the person he's out to get. Whereas Phyllis hates this kid. She's like, screw her. Like if I kill her father and she's upset, whatever. But like Neff like gets like this bonding moment with her. And that kind of like, I think softens him a little bit to what's happening. Because even at the end where like everything's gone to shit for him and his whole plan, he's still like looking out for her. Like he tells the kid, like he tells the boyfriend or the ex-boyfriend, like, here's her number, go call her. And he's like, I don't want to talk to her. And he's like, but she really wants to talk to you. Like even at the end where his whole life is basically over, he's still looking out for Lola. And so she's the innocent bystander in the sense that she's not foiling their plan, but she's like slowly taking away like his like cruelness to this and humanizing him a bit more to like what he's done.
And then she also like kind of inadvertently reveals a little bit of like Phyllis's own, I guess, sort of like what Phyllis is hiding from Neff. Because initially, like, I don't think Phyllis even like planned to tell Neff the hand that she had in Lola's mother's death. But because Lola doesn't see Neff as sort of like as a part of the conspiracy or doesn't even consider that he could be working against her, she trusts him enough to tell him, you know, like, oh, Phyllis did this to my mother. And so that's why I'm worried that she could have had a hand in my father's death. She sees him as sort of like as a source of help, not as a threat. And so because she gives him that information, that leads to him distrusting Phyllis a little bit and sort of like sowing that seed of doubt in the two of them's relationship.
Exactly. And I think that like seed of doubt within Neff is kind of like reflected through a lot of the cinematography that's used, because the first time they meet, it's very light. She's like standing on a balcony, I think, or like on the staircase. She's above him. So I think that dominance over him is already established from that scene alone. But the lighting is very, you know, it's very bright. And then as it slowly progresses and as he starts to kind of realize that he's trapped with her and that this is not something based off of love, but just like innate sexual desire and like manipulation, and that it wasn't really real. Like that last scene, you can hardly see them. It's very, very dark. And then instead of being like the flirtatious nature that happened in their first meeting, he kills her basically. Not basically, he kills her.
Literally.
Yeah, so that seed of doubt is really like just seen throughout the whole thing.
And we kind of, for Phyllis, she kind of like, we see her unravel from what she's trying to portray to Neff, because at first she's like, you know, trying to be all like seductive, and she's like, oh, my poor husband, like what if he gets in an accident, like he has this dangerous job. And then she goes like, then she plays like the, oh, my husband hits me, like he sucks, like he's, you know, jerk to me. And then it's like we see, especially in the car scene where they're driving away from the train tracks, and then they zoom in on her face, or No, it's when he's strangling Mr. Dietrichson and it's just on her face. And it takes, and I think that was one for me where I was like, there's nothing in her plan besides money and hatred. Because I had like a little bit of hope that like maybe the husband does suck and like maybe he is a little bit of a jerk to her and that's why. But because that was before we found out about what happened to the first Mrs. Dietrichson. But as soon as it zooms in on her face and it's not her looking any kind of guilty, any kind of remorse or sadness, it's just her being like, yeah, I got my plan together. It's like, that's the moment for the audience and for like the whole story where like her like little character portrayal that she's been doing falls away and she just turns into the femme fatale, which is another film noir kind of trope.
Yeah, she's very much like the, I guess, stereotypical version of like the femme fatale, and infidelity is also a giant part of her character, which was a giant part of the paranoia that was within the audience at that time, because this was like a post-war film and all these men were coming back from the war desensitized to violence, and like they were all worried about the power that women now had because they were now working, and then they were also kind of paranoid about them cheating on their husbands. So that kind of like unsuspecting bystander is also seen in that, and how like Phyllis's character is created through the fact that like men were questioning their wives too now, and instead of, in this movie this makes you question, you know, your insurance guy and like your next door neighbor and who's doing the perfect crime. So this is like the whole way this was written and the characters were created, especially in Phyllis, is like very reminiscent of that paradox we talked about earlier, where like that suspicion that was, you know, embedded in everyone at the time.
And then specifically about Phyllis's like relationship with her husband and sort of, you know, like the how much do you trust this woman? I think like one thing that kind of I think I saw this in one of the supplemental readings that we had of sort of, you know, like how much truth is Phyllis telling about her relationship with her husband? How much is she embellishing? Like what, like, you know, how much accuracy is there in the picture that she's presenting in F? Because she does feed him the whole like domestic abuse story of like, my husband deserves to die because he hits me, he hits his daughter, etc. And then what's interesting is that the first time we see Mr. Dietrichson, he is acting admittedly like a little bit of a dick. He's a bit controlling like of his wife, of his daughter. He doesn't really like, he's definitely a very overbearing presence. And so when you see that, you're sort of like, oh, okay, so she must have been telling the truth because he does seem like a bit of a dickhead. But then after it's revealed that she, you know, like orchestrated his first wife's murder, after she has like little to no reaction at all to a man being strangled right next to her, you sort of wonder, you know, like, okay, maybe Mr. Dietrichson wasn't that good of a guy, but, you know, like you kind of doubt if he was as bad as what Phyllis was leading us to believe, because the only like real view we get of their relationship is one that's filtered through her. And you trust that vision less and less as more is revealed about her.
Yeah, and also like maybe if she hadn't been in the beginning all like talking about him in a bad way, we would have just thought he was like a normal person, you know.
Yeah, exactly. He kind of falls also into that kind of trope of being like unsuspecting. He like, if he deserved it, whether or not, he's also like blind to what's happening right in front of his face, like right under his nose. Like Phyllis is playing, I think, chess with Lola while Neff is trying to like convince him to get the life insurance. Like he's in that position, kind of, that Keys and the audience are in.
Well, yeah, I think my first thought when we learned about like the suspicion, yes, was I was thinking of like all the people that don't have scripts in the movie. So like all the people in the store, and then like those are the people that don't suspect anything. But like totally everyone is like not noticing all these like other things. So like the main character, he gets killed. What was his name? The husband?
Dietrichson?
Yeah, so he isn't suspecting that he's gonna get killed, but he also isn't suspecting of like their relationship going on, like he's being cheated on or whatever. And then like Walter Neff, like he isn't aware of everything that Phyllis is doing. So there's just like all these like different dimensions to it.
Also, I kind of want to go back to the idea of like people coming back from the war and being untrusting, especially of like their spouses, because there was a scene where I thought we were going to find out like Neff had this really dark secret, obviously besides the whole like he murdered Mr. Dietrich sort of thing. Because I think it was when she first visits his apartment, he like they're sitting on the couch and he hugs her, and you notice on his hand he's wearing a ring on his like ring finger, and it's his left hand. And I thought, because he said, I think it was before they mentioned he wasn't married, didn't have a family, he lived alone. Like he says that he has a woman come and clean his apartment, and but yet you see like this like wedding ring, and I was wondering if either like at that moment I was like, oh, we're gonna find out this like dark secret Neff has, and then I was wondering like maybe that was just an error and like the actor had his wedding ring on or something like that, because they didn't mention anything about that. But I really thought for a moment we were gonna find out Neff had this like secret from like this like other family he had before.
This is also like a movie seen through his eyes. He's narrating it. So not that he's trying to make himself seem sympathetic in a way, but he's like, I don't feel like someone who's like narrating the events would willingly be like, yeah, and then I cheated on my wife with her. He's kind of like villainizing Phyllis and being like, she seduced me and then she manipulated me into killing her husband for her and I didn't even get the money. So yeah.
That's really interesting too, because there's the trope of like the femme fatale, but there's no, that I know of, trope like that for like the man, and then the man is always narrating too.
Yeah.
But
And I think like specifically about the femme fatale trope itself, because that is relevant here. I don't know if this is just because I'm unfamiliar with the noir genre, but I feel like I don't know, like the way that we see the femme fatale trope is kind of like it changed throughout the years, because I think there is definitely like a modern character archetype that we refer to as the femme fatale. But I think what we see of as the femme fatale in like a modern movie would be a character with like a little bit more agency, I'd assume. Someone who's like, I don't know, a little bit more like overtly threatening, and I guess sort of like threatening in a more like stereotypically like masculine way, where someone, you know, she takes the action and she, you know, like, I don't know, I guess like does the killing herself almost, because it seems like femme fatale as it originally existed and sort of like where it came from seemed to be more of like a woman who insidiously ruins the life of the male protagonist. Like Phyllis doesn't really ever get her hands dirty directly. She does help Neff move the body and she does drive the car where the murder takes place in. But as far as like, you know, like impersonating the husband, actually doing the strangling, she doesn't do any of that. And she doesn't really, I don't know, if you look at her actions sort of like objectively, it's not really anything that would seem like, I don't know, she's never really violent except in the last scene where she has the gun, but even then she doesn't ever shoot to kill almost.
yeah,
I don't know, it's all very indirect manipulation, sort of like almost setting off the dominoes to make things happen, and then kind of like sitting by and watching things play out. So it's, I don't know, I just think it's interesting how, I don't know, we like people who aren't familiar with the noir genre itself might have conceptions of like, oh, this is what a femme fatale is, but sort of the origins of the trope itself are very different from where they've ended up now.
Yeah, I think that femme fatales now, they kind of, like you said, do the dirty work themselves. And in like movies like this, women were objectified in the 1940s. This is no secret. So they used that as a tool, like to manipulate the men around them. And they used that and they kind of spin something that would have kind of oppressed them into something that made them a step above a man, because they knew that they could get control through that.
I think it's also the men, at least in the movies, made themselves so easy, I think, to kind of manipulate, because like Walter Neff, like in like the first like 5 minutes of knowing this woman, he calls her baby, and it's like,
Yeah.
you know she's married, you're there to see your husband, and you're already like, ooh, the anklet, and like he's just so obviously into her that it's like, even if she didn't want to manipulate, she could just be like, give me money, and he'd be like, here you go. Like, it would be so easy for her. I think they kind of, at least in the films, open up themselves so easily to be manipulated by women that it's kind of like, well, they have to take the opportunity. Like, they have it there, and they don't really have much agency in life at this time period that, like, okay, I'm going to use what I can get. Granted, Phyllis uses it for a really big negative, which murder, but even then, it's kind of like you got to use what you can get at that time period.
Yeah, and that scene when he first meets her and she's like in a towel and then she goes to change and he's like so enamored and in love with her already. That's like when we see the Venetian blinds, which is like very noir. They project these lines all over his body and all over the room, and it's like very harsh light, and I think that's very reminiscent of like the doom that's about to come in his life, about, you know, his downfall. That's very much foreshadowing of that.
Because that specific lighting does come back again in that final, you know, like confrontation where they both shoot each other. Where instead of, you know, like I think you brought this up earlier, where, you know, like you've got the lighting, you've got like a light to dark balance in the first meeting, which is more like heavily, I don't know, like angled towards light, and then, you know, like the ratio is reversed in the final, like, you know, again, like final meeting, but we still have that sort of like that blind shadow.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like film noir films are they always like come back to the beginning. So it like comes back to the beginning in the voiceover, but it also does it like in the lighting and the shot and everything. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Is there anything that anyone wants to, you know, additionally add in terms of unsuspicion and how that plays into this film?
I think, oh, I'm sorry. Thanks. I think also just like the character of Neff, just his job, I don't know, because like he works in insurance, and like my dad works in insurance. I think my dad does the most boring thing ever, and yet like now I'm gonna go home and be like, Dad, like, have you caught someone planning a murder? Because like I don't know, like insurance to me is so boring, and I've had to listen to car rides full of insurance talk, and then in this film we see like an insurance salesman get really into murder, and he uses insurance as like another motive. He's like, because he uses the whole double indemnity thing of like, well, if he dies this way, we get twice as much money, because it's such a rare way to die that it's like insurance actually does play a part into like how they come up with the murder. And it's like, I just never thought of insurance as that exciting. And so now I'm definitely going to go home and ask my dad about it.
Yeah, and sort of like what's interesting too is sort of like it's someone that he does have the figure of someone you can trust, where it's sort of like he's selling you the thing that'll make sure your family is okay if anything bad happens to you. And it's specifically because he's inside the system and he knows the system so well that he can exploit the system to, you know, to screw you over even harder. Because if he was an insurance agent, he wouldn't have been there in the first place. But if he hadn't known the system so well, he wouldn't have known specifically about that clause. He wouldn't have known like about the ins and outs of the other things, even sort of like the since he works with keys and since he knows, you know, like all the things that get, you know, people who are trying to, you know, like I said, like insurance fraud and people who are trying to fake accidents and murders just to get the payout. He knows all the pitfalls they fall into, and specifically because of that, he is finding all these ways that he and Phyllis can avoid them to pull off the murder even better.
Yeah, because all the stuff he told her to do, I wouldn't have thought of. Like, and like I listen to a lot of true crime. I felt like I could have done this really well myself. But then as he's like telling her all the things to like keep keys like away from like their scent, I'm like, I wouldn't have thought of that. I would have thought of putting someone else on the train. I wouldn't have thought of any of the stuff. And so it's like, and then we see like the scene where we see Keys. Neff gets called into his office, and Keys is literally exposing somebody for insurance fraud. So you already see Keys as like this person who's like, he's got that little man in his chest, and he knows and stuff like that. And so we already see Keys as like, oh, like he knows everything, even though we also are supposed to think he knows nothing and about like the plan. So it's like he already is exposed to Keys' ability to kind of blow all these plans wide open. And I don't know, it's just like, it's wild that like he was able to think of all these things. And I think it's because of his relationship with Keys and how Keys has blown open supposedly all these other insurance fraud cases, that he's seen what people have done wrong and he's learned from it.
Yeah, what you said about him knowing everything yet knowing nothing, I think that also like applies to what this movie is trying to inadvertently maybe make us think about. Like, we think we know everything and we think we see everything, but this movie kind of makes us question whether or not we know absolutely nothing.
I think especially when Phyllis gets exposed, we're like, oh, we don't know anything about these characters.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's sort of, it covers pretty much every facet of life that would be very like relevant to a viewer, at the time, because, you have workplace with the insurance agency, you have, like friendships in the case of Neff and Keys, you have, like romantic life, just like every single facet, like major facet of your life that like is important, that is important to you and that you could be worried about. Sort of like there's always the possibility that you don't know anything about one of these, all of these, etc.
Exactly. Yeah, so does anyone else have something to add to this, not only the paradox or just the movie in general?
I think we kind of covered all like I'm sure we could, if we had, 2 hours, you could find all the little things in the film that were like, oh, like we thought we knew this, but we didn't. But
Yeah.
I think we covered the big things and like the ones that really like impact the plot the most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had one thing written down about how Mr. Diedrichson was murdered off camera, and it was very much focused on Phyllis's face. Yeah, and like understandably in the 1940s, they had things that they couldn't show on, in movies. So like they obviously couldn't show him being murdered, but I think the way they filmed that shot with like him just being strangled in the back, like what's happening, but you kind of take away, I guess, the identity from Mr. Diedrichson, and you're kind of being able to apply the whole unsuspicion to like different facets of like the audience's life, even being able to explore that.
It's more ominous too because we heard it.
Yeah.
We heard and see it, and I think that's even more like scary. Is like because I think it's just human nature to want to see everything and know what's going on, and just to hear something, especially something that's like so like terrifying, and just to focus on this woman who, and the film is supposed to be like unsuspecting. She's just like, yes, she's the femme fatale, but when Neff sees her for the first time, he's like, oh yeah, she's hot, but like she's not a murderer. And then and it's just to focus on somebody that's supposed to be like unsuspecting in society while you're hearing something so like grotesque and evil. It has this really great, my favorite word, juxtaposition for the film, and I really like it.
Yeah, and I just like I think ironically, because I know that it was for censorship reasons, and I know that like it's just because the studios wouldn't allow them to actually show that kind of scene. But I feel like, even if, like that wasn't in place and we had seen like the full frontal shot of the murder, I don't think it would have been as effective as it being off screen and then us seeing Phyllis's reaction. Because I do like that her reaction is prioritized, because if you compare her to Mr. Diedrichson, she's the more important character in the story. And I do think that it's more important that we see, like how she reacts to things, and, like the kind of person that she is, like in having this very calm, very nothing reaction to a murder happening 1 foot away from her. And I know I just like it also goes back to, like the idea that horror is more effective if you don't see every aspect of what's supposed to scare you. If we saw, like the entirety of the murder, sort of like everything laid out there, I don't think it would have been as,
kind of like funny, I feel like. If
a little bit.
Yeah. Your imagination's allowed to fill in the little pieces.
I mean, movies like follow this technique now still, and like we don't have the same like censorship as they did.
Yeah.
It's also like it contributes more to the plot to see her versus him, because I think if we just saw him die, we'd be like, okay, yeah, he's dead. But to see her, like see how like her face gets, we understand her character 10 times more than we did before. So it definitely contributes a lot more to the story of the film than if we just saw him die.
Cool.
All right.
Good job, everyone.
Yeah, I guess that's it.
Yeah.
Awesome. See you next week.
Should we have a sign off or something?
I don't know.
It
So I say bye, Hugh.